Kum.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I rise in support of the bill. This bill seeks to refine the Act by implementing changes that the Deputy Prime Minister had announced in the Committee of Supply debate earlier this year. These refinements are positive and much welcome. Having said that, I have 3 points for the Deputy Prime Minister's consideration. Sir, of all the amendments, the relaxation of the eligibility criteria for an overseas voter is the most significant. A Singapore citizen must now spend an aggregate of 30 days in the past 3 years in Singapore to qualify for overseas voting. It removes the previous eligibility criteria, which had been heavily criticized. This will have the effect of enabling many more overseas Singaporeans to vote. It also means that at the next general elections, overseas polling stations are likely to receive many more overseas voters than in the 2006 elections. Now, Section 39 of the Act specifies that the presiding officer of a polling station, which includes an overseas polling station, shall exclude from the polling station all persons except voters allotted to that polling station, the candidates, the polling agents of each candidate, and other persons involved in the functioning of the polling station. My question is whether the government will make special provision to enable polling agents of candidates to be present in overseas polling stations. While the Act as it now stands permits parties to send their polling agents to overseas polling stations, the reality is that travel costs would be so high as to make this prohibitive and unrealistic. That being the case, I propose that the government should fund the travel of one polling agent from each political party involved in elections to each overseas polling station where overseas voters in respect of constituencies contested by their party are registered to vote, so that all parties will be able to appropriately monitor the various overseas polling stations. This will ensure that the same degree of transparency and accountability applies to both local and overseas polling stations and preclude any allegations of vote rigging, foul play, or other unfairness. My second point relates to early voting for overseas voters. Ms. Sylvia Lim had raised this issue in last year's COS, and I think she has mentioned this slightly earlier. Sir, at COS this year, the Deputy Prime Minister had answered that there are many implications to early voting which made it unfeasible, including the fact that overseas Singaporeans would then only witness 4 to 5 days of campaigning from overseas before voting, which may not be enough for them to form a conclusion on whom to vote for. I urge the Deputy Prime Minister to reconsider this and to permit early voting for overseas voters. The concern raised by Ms. Lim is certainly true, that there is a valid concern about anonymity in some wards, in particular single-member constituencies. It seems to me that there is little qualitative difference between 5 days of campaigning and 9 days of campaigning. I believe that the benefits of permitting early voting for overseas voters far outweigh the potential problems. And certainly, if the government was keen to give Singaporeans more time to come to an informed conclusion, then it should provide for a much longer campaign period than the statutory minimum of 9 days, which has been the practice in past elections. Also in this year's COS, Mr. Matthias Yao had raised the question of contingency plans to deal with possible disruptions to the smooth conduct of elections, such as severe weather on nomination day and polling day. The Deputy Prime Minister's response then was that the Elections Department was looking into this, and legislative amendments will be introduced to address such situations. The bill currently before this House does not appear to address this issue. I therefore hope that the Deputy Prime Minister can update this House on the status of the Elections Department's work on contingency planning and the proposed legislative amendments that he had referred to in this year's COS. Sir, the amendment bill before this House is a well-balanced piece of legislation that preserves the principles of democracy by enabling many more overseas Singaporeans to vote than is presently the case. This keeps our general elections relevant in today's globalized world. I believe that the refinements that I have suggested will improve the Act even more. With that, I support the bill.